coming to St. Nersa's Seminary, Dr. Irvin spent a little more than 20 years in Jerusalem, most of it living in the Armenian monastery, teaching in the St. Tarkmanchat School and other Jerusalem institutions. She was blessed to be the disciple of Archbishop Norai Bogharian, curator of manuscripts for the Patriarchate, and Bishop Gyurek Kapikyan, overseer of the status quo in the holy places. What she saw and learned under their guidance laid the foundation for a lifelong devotion to Armenian Christian studies and to the history of Armenian Jerusalem. Dr. Irvin, your screen.
In the building, which is the goal of our pilgrimage, after our quest this morning to understand all of the veneration of Mary that most segments of the Christian world share. For us, as for many others, she is more than a saint. She is the Mother of God. And so in the Armenian Jerusalem tradition, her tomb is called Astvadzamor Keresman, not simply Mary's tomb, not the tomb of Saint Mary, but the tomb of the Mother of God. But in order to appreciate this place where we're going and its long history of faith and hope, we have to get there first. And that means that we need to know something, some important things, more than one, about the geographical context of Mary's last years, things that the tradition tells us, but that are not really visible anymore at ground level. Yesterday, Arpi and Vartan gave us a fun aerial overview of the pilgrimage route that we'll be taking. And today, in fact, we will follow that route in more detail with some changes that will allow us to bring it closer to what the ancient path would have been. So I'm going to start with something similar to what they did yesterday and say, if we're going to come to Mary's tomb, first we need to come to Jerusalem. And it would be wonderful if we could come there aerially before the city was even built, so that we could see, first of all, that this is not in any way, shape, or form a flat location. If we were to hover right above the place where Jerusalem is now, before Jerusalem was built, we would see that Jerusalem is actually built on, more likely, better way to put it might be to say that it drapes across several hills. You can see 3 of them here in the depiction. And we're going to keep our eye mostly on the larger hill to the left, which is the one where the Armenian quarter is now located. So Jerusalem doesn't look like this anymore, obviously, but if you know where to look, even today, you can feel the presence of those hills underlying the city buildings. You can see how the rough rectangle of the city is set out across all 3. The large portion of it falling on that southwestern hill. And even today, the valleys that surround the hill, the valleys that make this into a mountainous area, are very clear. In this slide, you can see them in dark green. There's a valley to the left, valley to the west. There's a valley to the east, and the 2 join together in a valley to the south. There are actually more valleys than this, but these are the 3 that matter to us. And if we look at the dark green on the slide, we can see that it almost looks as though the city is sitting cupped inside them, like a stone in the setting of a ring, or like a goblet in a giant hand. And these valleys are very important, both in Jerusalem's architecture and in its history. They both protected Jerusalem's southern side, and they limited its growth in that direction. And it's one of these valleys that we will be walking on today a little bit later. But we're not there yet, because first I want to orient us to the way that these valleys are incorporated into Jerusalem today. Here's a picture from the southwest actually, or southwest of Jerusalem, looking up into the city. And you can see that there are roads. There's one that comes down from the north. There's one that goes around to the east. And there's another one that kind of goes off to the left of the screen. Those are the three valleys that we saw in the previous picture. Now they're the modern roads around the city. And you can see how the building on the hill that we were looking at, the left hill, which is most of this picture, how much you can do with that hill, where you can go on that hill, is determined by the valleys that run below it, where the road goes. It's kind of interesting. You can see that the walls of the city don't sit exactly above those valleys, which is what we might expect. You would build them out to the extent possible. But instead, a good portion of that bigger hill, that left-hand hill, is exposed. It's not enclosed inside the city proper, as it should be. You see that there's a wall that runs across the middle of the picture in a straight line, rather than coming out and around the curve of the hill. Actually, the story says that the city architect was executed for not building the wall out to the edge of the hill and enclosing all of that inside the city. Be that as it may, the area in front of that wall is called Mount Zion. And the area behind the wall, the area to the top of the photograph, the northern area, is what was known in Jesus's time as the Upper City. Today, it's the Armenian Quarter. So we're going to take another look at this from a slightly different angle. So I want you to keep your eye on, you see there's a tower in the middle ground. And next to it is a bluish looking gray dome. I want you to keep your eye on those two things, because we're going to be going there on our way to Mary's tomb, and because they're useful for orienting ourselves to where we are. Okay, are you ready to change angles a little bit? We're going to come down a little bit closer. And here you can see the tower and the dome at the bottom left of the picture, and the wall running just behind them, just north of them. What you see in the picture now is pretty much the whole Armenian Quarter. The quarter is everything you can see in the picture. You can see that it's a very complex place. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but for anyone who is interested, Arpi's family home is right here next to the school. St. Tarkmanchat's school at the back end of the monastery. As you can see, there's really no place to touch down here, no place to come lower. So what we're going to do is we're going to hover along above the road that you can see in the middle of the picture, going from the lower left to the upper right. Yesterday, in Arpi and Vartan's aerial tour, we came down that road from the other end, following the streak of light. And where we're headed for is the area in the upper right corner of the screen. You can see there's a big city gate complex there. That's how we're going to get into the city. And so we're going to hover along this roadway until we get there, partly just because it's fun to do and because we can. Passing through the whole length of the quarter, past the Patriarchate proper, past the residential areas, past what are now commercial areas, down to the city gate. And now we're going to do it to your head again. I'm going to flip the angle a little bit so that we can actually come in at that gate. So here it is from a different angle as we are turning in order to touch down our imaginary little jetpacks here at the Jaffa Gate. It's called the Jaffa Gate because the big road leaving it eventually leads down to the port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast, which is where pilgrims coming by sea in previous centuries would first arrive in the Holy Land and then have to make their way up to the mountain ridge on which Jerusalem sits. A 2-day process, or perhaps even 3. Inside the gate, you can see that there's a smaller road that curves around to the right, going into the city. That's the same road that we were hovering over before, and now we are going to follow that road back into the Armenian quarter. So let's begin our descent into the area of the Jaffa Gate, where you can see to your right part of the buildings that comprised the Roman garrison in this area, the time of Jesus. And we're going to come even lower and touch down on the big square that's just inside that gate. And we would be landing amid the hotels and the shops and the bustling of tourists and pilgrims and locals that keeps this area especially busy and lively most of the time. And you can see the mix of peoples that congregate here, all of them attracted by the fact that this is the holy city for all 3 monotheistic religions. And this happens to be a pretty good time to begin our walk to and through the Armenian quarter, where our pilgrimage to Mary's tomb will really start. Bread is just arriving. It's a good moment. There is nothing like fresh, hot bread that came right out of the oven is brought to your door in Jerusalem on a sunny morning when the air is a little bit cool before it gets really hot during the day, which it would at this time of year. And so we're going to follow the delivery man past the post office on the left and past the police station as it is now, this big building right in ahead of us that marks where Herod's palace once stood. And a few feet from here, we will be within the Armenian quarter proper, a fact that is acknowledged by everyone. This is Armenian Patriarchate Street. There are also St. James Road and some other very Armenian names. So it's obvious where we are and to whom this area is home. This is a place where Armenians have been since the earliest days of Christianity and possibly even before. The community in Jerusalem is the oldest continually functioning Armenian community outside of Armenia. And one of the fun things about the Armenian quarter is that the more you know about the place, the more you understand that as you're walking along on your ordinary day, or as part of your ordinary pilgrimage, it only looks like we are walking on a 21st century street. Everything that we see around us is built on top of something else. And that may have been built on top of something else. There has been an accretion of layers in this city. Everything that we see around us in this picture, for example, is built on something from the time of Christ and of earliest Christianity. It's though what we see on the street is actually the tip of a historical iceberg. Jerusalem is one of those places where what you see is not what you get. And as we move deeper into the Armenian quarter, the buildings on our left are built above 4th century vanks, not exactly monasteries in the sense that we think of, but places of accommodation that housed pilgrims coming to Jerusalem, specifically from the Caucasus region. So there were buildings here for Albanian Christians, there were buildings for Georgians, Armenians, other people from that area. It was, you could hear the mix of Caucasian languages as you walk down the street in pilgrimage season. Not only is the hilltop underneath us still there, but all around us are the remnants and signs of Jesus and Mary's Jerusalem. Their Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of the disciples, is still here. In their time, the first century as we like to reckon time, this was quite a nice neighborhood. And several of the disciples had places here where they would stay whenever they were in the city. It was incumbent upon Jewish men, at least, to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem several times a year for the major feasts. So having a regular place to go made sense. It wouldn't have to be something huge, but a place that you knew where you were going, you would be welcome there, you could stay and be comfortable during the holy seasons. So do you see the tunnel that's right ahead of us? Just before we get there, you can't quite see it from this angle, but just before we get there, there's a quiet little side street on the left that's part of our itinerary this morning. And once we turn down this little street, we are kind of leaving the road that curves around the city wall and heading into the heart of the Armenian quarter. So we'll follow this road. It curves around to the left. And then we'll go around a corner where you see those two people walking. The street continues. And if we keep going down that street, eventually it will lead down a rough flight of stairs. They're all different levels of stairs. And we find ourselves in front of the door of the Syriac church that now stands on the spot where Mark had his Jerusalem home, the place where Jesus and his disciples gathered for the Last Supper. Maybe on our next pilgrimage, we can stop and go inside. It's a fascinating place. What isn't a fascinating thing in Jerusalem, actually? So it's interesting. Mark had a place here in what's now the Armenian quarter on the Western Hill, but he's not the only one. So if we retrace our steps back up the stairs and onto that roadway, go around the corner again, the other direction, this time we might notice that there is a lot of really dense overgrowth peering over the top of that wall. Behind that wall are the remains of a church that sits on the spot, that marks the spot, where the Apostle Thomas too had his little Jerusalem dwelling. It's not apparent from the street that there's anything there. There used to be fewer trees when I lived there and you could get a better view, but I didn't think to take a picture then. I thank Arpi's father for this photograph. If we go on a little bit farther, you can still see the bits of the overgrowth up there at the top. We notice that the stones and that wall are not all the same. And then if we look a little bit more closely than that, we see what was once the archway of the entrance to that church that stood on the spot of the home of Thomas. So that's kind of That's kind of fun, actually. There's Mark and Thomas living in the same neighborhood when they're in the holy city, not that far from each other. So who else of Jesus's close disciples might have been in this neighborhood? When we come back to that main Jerusalem Patriarchate road again, let's turn left at that yellow door. When we do, we pass through a tunnel. You can see the tunnel once had a couple of little Armenian shops built into its sides in the days before there was automobile traffic to really up the pollution level. Those were quite nice little places. And when we get to the other side of the tunnel, we find ourselves in front of the great entrance to the Armenian monastery that is the kernel of the Armenian quarter. The place is named, I'm sure most of you know, Vankayots, Sirpots Hagopians, the Armenian convent of Saint Jacques or Saint James, Deir el Armen, Mar Yaoub. So in all the relevant languages to the area at the time when the sign was made, this is the heart of the Armenian presence in Jerusalem. And it's named the Armenian convent of Saint James because its cathedral is built over the site of the house of James, Jesus's stepbrother. And very interesting things were discovered probably a century ago now when the flooring in the church was taken up for renovations. Remnants of what had been an ancient domestic establishment. And I can't tell you how tempting it is to stop here, because this monastery is home not only to an Armenian monastic brotherhood and an Armenian lay community, but it also houses almost endless historical treasures. But we won't stop today, because where we are aiming for at this moment is the Jerusalem home of the disciple that we're told Jesus loved, the evangelist John, which was just a couple of hundred yards further south than the home of James. Like I said, it's just a couple of hundred yards further south, but in Jerusalem with its walls and alleys, you can't get there from here, not directly. So we're going to keep walking. The wall of the monastery is on your left, and ahead of you, the bridge that you see with the fancy windows houses the Armenian Patriarch's official residence. And so we're going to carry on, passing underneath that bridge as we continue to follow Armenian Patriarchate Road until we see in the distance, do you recognize it from this side? This is that same tower that we saw in our aerial view. So we know that it marks the part of Mount Zion left outside the city wall. And in fact, you can see the city wall underneath it. It looks like they're actually one thing, but they're not. There's space in between them, as we'll see. And it would be great if there were a way to just walk out of the wall here, but there's not. There are only 7 passageways through the city wall. So we need to keep walking around until we come to one. Again, the wall of the monastery is on our left. The city wall is on our right. As we're walking along, let me remind you that John was close to the high priestly clan, so it's not really surprising that he had for himself a pretty prized location, just a stone's throw from the high priest's hilltop palace at the airy, very scenic edge of Mount Zion, right above the valley. So the first gate that we come to is the Zion Gate, and so we'll go out of this one. It's appropriately named because it connects Mount Zion outside the walls to the neighborhood inside. And we're going to leave the Armenian quarter by making a sharp right into this gate, and then making an equally sharp left to get out of it back into the light. And once we're outside the gate, you can imagine doing this in a car, well, many people do. Here we are on Mount Zion. And to find the location of the high priest's palace, the place where Jesus was tried on the night before his crucifixion, we turn right. And almost immediately, here we are, standing in front of a gate, the entrance to what's now the Armenian cemetery. And in that cemetery, an ancient church once stood on the fateful spot of Jesus's trial. Sadly, this monastery was in no man's land when the Jordanians and the Israelis were fighting over Jerusalem. So the church that stood here originally was destroyed, as was a large portion of the cemetery. And as things happen in chaotic times, the mosaic floors, the other valuable artifacts in this area were looted. And eventually Armenians began constructing a new church on the site. As you can see, it was never completed for various reasons. But when they began to construct the new church, the Armenians discovered that one good thing had come out of all of that devastation. If you walk around to the side of the church, you see the three low archways that look like windows on your left. If you were to go down into that window, if you're small, agile, and so on, or if someone will just hold you over the edge and you have a good light, you will see that underneath the floor of the church are the excavated remnants of the first century residential neighborhood. You can walk around in it. You can see archways, staircases, and so on. And even at the back of the monastery, some tiny little bits of the mosaic floor of the much earlier church. You can see it just barely visible here, very simple pattern running diagonally across the center of the picture. Here's a little bit bigger, better fragment, although this looks worse now than it did when I last saw it. You can see these are serviceable, but very good quality floors. These did manage to escape the looting. I don't know whether they were too close to a wall to be pried up well or what it was, but they're still there. Little proofs that there was actually a much older structure on this spot. So again, we could spend a lot of time in this place, but we want to come back out into the light, into the main part of the monastery, because we notice now that just beyond the church and that accompanying square monastic building, you can see the edge of that dome that we've been following. We can see, here's a better picture of it, the tower and the dome that mark the spot where John lived when he was in Jerusalem. And once again, as you could see from the previous picture, we are really close to it. But you can't get there from here. And so we have to go back out the same door that we came in, turn right again, so that we enter into narrow street. Now you can see the dome straight ahead. And where the street branches, we're going to take the right-hand path. And we know we're in the right place because a 7th century pilgrim named Arculf drew a little map, a little sketch to show where Mary had died. And this is the spot that he drew. On it, there now stands not the housing block that John would have lived in, but the magnificent Abbey Church of Mary's Dormition, or her death, depending on your tradition. And inside, downstairs, this church has a chapel commemorating her death. So when Jesus on the cross gave his mother into John's care, it seems that he was not just cementing a bond of affection between two of his nearest and dearest, making sure that Mary would be well taken care of. He was also ensuring that from John's comfortable home, with its beautiful view of the valley, she would be within a 5-minute walk of several other disciples, including her stepson, James. And she would be able easily to go to the temple, a short walk to the east, whenever she wanted to. And in fact, even if she couldn't go, from John's garden, or his balcony if he had one, or if he didn't, just through the open windows, she would be able to hear the services that were taking place there in the sacred precinct that was just 150 yards away. According to the earliest traditions, Mary died at John's home just before, or maybe shortly after, the apostles began dispersing to preach. So it was from this location on a quiet residential street that Mary's body would have been carried past the palace of the high priest where Jesus had been tried on the left, and then gradually down past the place where Peter had gone to weep after his betrayal of the Lord. You can see the church named the Church of St. Peter of the Cockcrow standing here in the middle. She would have been taken that way because from the spot where that church now stands, there is a staircase that led from that spot, and these are stairs that Peter and the others had used to follow Jesus out from the Last Supper at Mark's home. Stairs that led down into the very beautiful Kidron Valley, the same valley that from the air we saw holding the city of Jerusalem to the right on the east. This valley runs below the temple complex, where, according to tradition, Mary once served as a young girl. And so with the temple wall and the city high above them, Mary's funeral procession would have made its sad way. The Kidron Valley was a valley of tombs, and they would have passed by many other tombs, some of them very simple, carved into the rock, some more sophisticated, and even some that were very splendid funerary monuments. And the valley would have gradually opened out, spreading and greening in front of them until they came to a low area at the foot of the Mount of Olives, just past where this church now stands. The valley would come out in another part of the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus had prayed before the crucifixion, before his arrest. And in this garden, more nested complexes of burial caves cut into the rock housed the bodies of the newly dead until the time that their dried bones could be gathered together in a box for safekeeping at their family home or in another location. So death literally and graphically and physically brought mourners down on a descent from the ordinary life up above in the city to the silent caves below. And it was there, in one of these quiet caves, that they laid Mary's body on a stone bench to begin the natural process of decay. Other caves have since disappeared, making way for various construction projects, but Mary's is still there. And one ancient description that we have of her cave says that it had three parts. It had a large kind of antechamber, here marked with a number 1. And there were 2 smaller caves behind it with a central area joining them. And as we're going to see in just a minute, although almost everything around these caves was cut away, these 3 chambers were left. There has been a shrine on this spot of this burial cave since at least the mid-5th century and probably the late 4th, which is interesting to us, not just because it would make the church old, but because it would make it contemporary with St. Sahak and Mesrop. By the 6th century, a feast that celebrated Mary's life, death, and assumption into heaven was already celebrated in that church, whatever it looked like, on August 15th. Now, what you see here does not look very church-like. You can see that toward the top of the picture, there's a bell tower, but it looks very short. And there's no church anywhere to be seen. This little dome here is an Islamic tomb. What has happened is that over time, erosion of the nearby slope, plus many added layers of resurfacing on the roadway where you can see the cars going, has made the tomb of Mary even lower than it was originally. So now, after we have descended all the way from the hill where John's house was, we're still a long way above the level of the tomb. In fact, you can just barely see a little bit of its roof line. Here we've come down a ways already, and we're still almost at the roof line of the church. And what the earliest building over Mary's tomb looked like, we don't know exactly, except that it seems to have been built as a polygon, so almost circular, as close to circular as they could get it. It was a popular floor plan for holy place churches. There are just tantalizing little descriptions from the different times that it was rebuilt over the centuries. There was a whole upper floor described as being resplendent with the richest mosaics, marble, lights, frescoes. All of that is completely gone. All that's left now, all that we see in front of us, is the original church's basement, called a crypt. And so as we start down the stairs to go even lower towards this crypt, we find ourselves looking across into a beautiful garden. This happens to be the garden where the caretaker, the Armenian overseer of Mary's tomb, lives. This is the Armenian Garden of Gethsemane. The caretaker is responsible for the daily services here as well as the running of the church. And Armenians will stop to rest in this garden on feast days. It's very beautiful. There are fruit trees, it's shady. For a number of years, there was also a hermit artist who lived in a cave at the back of the garden. A small, silent man. And I can remember going to his cave and sitting silently watching him painting and praying, surrounded by lighted candles, with just the most peaceful expression on his face. What his story was, I do not know. How he came to be there, I don't know. But he was there as a presence, part of Mary's tomb and the spirituality that surrounded it. From this level, the level of the Armenian Gethsemane garden, we can see that the roof of the church is flat. It's simply the floor of the church that once rose magnificently above it. So of course it has drainage problems and this and that. And behind the church, see, here it is, it's completely flat. You could rollerblade on that. Behind it, under the pointed metal roof, are the remains of mosaic floors and pillars from the Byzantine monastic buildings that once housed monks and nuns who cared for this church and its pilgrims. And so we'll keep going down the stairs. And as we come to the bottom of the last turn, we see how big the open area is in front of this tomb basement church. How important it is for there to be space for groups and processions to venerate this sacred spot. And we can clearly see how important the wall of the Armenian garden to the left is for this church. This is what keeps the garden out of the courtyard. This is what facilitates the drainage of sometimes very torrential rain here in the fall and winter. So it's not just beautiful, it's also serviceable. And here we are, all the way down in the courtyard of the basement church. And we can look back at where we came from. We are a long way below the roadway. And so now we are ready to go in through the really, truly ugly door. And you look at that and you think, what kind of a door is this for the tomb of the Mother of God? Well, there was once a much more imposing and beautiful entrance. And as you can see from the way the arches are set, because of drainage problems and frequent flooding, it was gradually made smaller and smaller. And finally, it was replaced entirely in the 20th century with a flood barrier. That door doesn't look like much, but it's certainly better than having to shovel mud and debris out of the church every winter. And so ignoring the lack of beauty of the entranceway, once we step through that door, we realize something. We thought we had reached the lowest point, but oh no, we are not actually at the bottom yet. Now we must go even farther down into the coolness and the quiet of this first century cave complex. And it's interesting that no one who comes here records the number of stairs down the same way. But everyone notices that the stairs are extremely wide. And a broad staircase was a way of accenting the importance of the place it led to. This staircase reminds one of the very magnificent steps that originally led up to the grand entrance of the Holy Sepulchre Church. I believe that they are the second widest steps of any holy site in the Holy Lands. So descending this staircase, we can see that there were once tall windows that lighted the staircase. There were golden crystal mosaics that reflected the light. None of that's there now, because when the city fell to the great Islamic conqueror Salahuddin in the late 12th century, those were all removed, like the entire upper church was, in order to provide funds and materials for repairing the city wall that had been damaged in the takeover. And piles of rubble from the demolition of the upper story rose higher than the level of the windows, so most of them were sealed up with stone, as was the doorway to the stairs that used to lead to the upper church. And the tomb's original darkness and quiet returned. As our eyes adjust on the way down, and as the temperature cools on the way down, we are mentally prepared to find ourselves in the original cave. And so at the bottom, if we know where to look, we can see that we are indeed surrounded by raw stone, even though there are paintings and other things that conceal parts of it, and a vault has been built on top of it in order to support the roof and the church that used to be above. The line of the bedrock is still visible. You can see a big chunk of it here right next to the altar of St. Nicholas. And across from that, this is on the south side of the church. If you look to the north side of the church, the same is true over there. You can follow the line of the wall of the cave. And if you remember that diagram of the three parts of the cave, you could also envision this space as being shaped kind of like an irregular cross. And at the head of the cross, at the east end of the church, is the Greek altar of the Theotokos, with her beautiful icon above it, and the accompanying altar of St. Stephen. And there are very beautiful traditions that are associated with this part of the church for this feast. So on the day of Mary's feast, in addition to the altar itself, there will also be a life-size silver recumbent statue of Mary, laid on a flower-decked table in this space. So that people who want to graphically, viscerally, physically participate in some way in her Assumption can do so by passing underneath the table on their knees, entering, as it were, into her tomb space and rising again beyond it. At the opposite end of this cross, the west end, the foot of the cross, so to speak, is the Armenian altar of the presentation, where the Copts also come to celebrate liturgy on Wednesdays and Fridays. And when liturgy is celebrated on this altar, the priest and the people who are looking toward the center of the church space do have the sensation of worshiping in a cave. The centerpiece of the church, the centerpiece of the cave complex, the centerpiece of the cross is the tomb itself, or what remains of it. An 18th century Armenian writer said that if we were to map the church not as a cross, but as a human body, the tomb is at the place of the heart. And just behind the tomb on the left, you can see part of the Armenian altar of Thaddeus and Bartholomew, or the altar of the apostles, where the Syrian Orthodox come to celebrate liturgy. And if you look above it, there's a line of raw stone. And if you follow that line, you will see that just past the picture that's on the very left of this photograph, here's a picture of the whole line of it, you will see the opening of another cave, left open to show that this location was indeed part of a cave complex. There were other tombs here than Mary's. She was not alone. And yet, hers is the only tomb that we venerate. Early pilgrims described the beauty of this tomb with awe. Deacon Eric mentioned some of this morning. The cave wall remained, you can see it sketched here, but it was surrounded, encased in marble. The marble facing was both for beauty and for protection, and the luxurious marble covering had pillars, arcades, mosaics, frescoes, inscriptions, carvings. A gold and silver dome stood above it. It was surrounded and framed in verses and famous sayings about Mary, and lamps hung in each one of those archways. All of that is gone now. And so most of the resemblance to Christ's tomb has been lost. All of the marble and other things were taken for other building projects by various governments that controlled the holy city over the centuries. Together with one piece of the once exquisite band of marble carvings, you can see it there to the right. One single part of the cave's raw rock wall is now exposed on the north side of the tomb. So when you exit the tomb, it's exactly to your right. And as you look through that very low doorway, the stone funerary bench where Mary's body lay also remains. So back to the center of the church. As we look at the tomb, the heart of the church, the center of the cross, from the southern side, the first thing that we notice is that there's an altar that's directly attached to the tomb, where the Armenian priest is standing in his green robe. This is an Armenian altar. It is used by no one else. It was built by the extremely pious Armenian king of Cilicia, Hetum II. In 1300, Hetum very briefly governed Jerusalem for the Mongols. And this altar was one of his gifts to the holy places. There was a plaque behind it, a lead plaque directly fastened to the wall of the tomb with an inscription that recorded his gratitude to God for his success in a military campaign against the Egyptians. But in the cleanup after one of the floods in the 17th century, the plaque was removed. The inscription had been recorded, fortunately, and so Armenians had it carved again and put back, this time not on the wall of the tomb, but on the altar itself. So whenever there's not a service going on, people like us can visit the tomb itself. And as we approach the door, we begin to realize how very low it is, because it is, in fact, the size of the doorway that led into the burial cave originally. And so we have to bend down low when we go through it. And as we bend down, minding our head while we get the first glimpse of the quiet inside of this little cave, our eyes may notice these pilgrim crosses carved into the marble of the south door jamb. It's lovely to see those. And once we notice them, we may also notice these. The modest inscription of the man who was Patriarch of Jerusalem just from 1677 to 1680. Mardiros Charimetzi, Mardiros from the Crimea. Hishadage der Mardirosi Archiepiscopos Jerusalema. He was a controversial man, but he showed his humble side of devotion to Mary in this plain and simple inscription. When we finally do squeeze through the doorway and stand before the altar that lies on top of Mary's funeral bench, if we look up, we notice that the cave roof has been cut away to make room for a domed ceiling. A ceiling that blends almost seamlessly into the raw rock wall of the cave that you can see just below the light fastened in the wall. The dome makes it possible, it's a very practical thing, makes it possible for a priest to stand upright in the tomb in order to offer badarak without having to do it on his knees. And as you can see, the tomb bench itself is covered, faced with marble, encouraging pilgrims to reach through and touch the bench, but making it hard to take away a piece of the rock as souvenirs, which is something everybody wants to do. Well, in addition to taking souvenirs and worshiping here, people also wanted to be buried here. And although the location of their graves is not certain, the princesses Constanza and Philippa of Antioch and their brother Reynald are somewhere in this church. And at this point, if it weren't a feast day, we would make our way back up the stairs so that I can show you some of these tombs that we do know the location of. Passing by the altar of St. Nicholas again on our left, we would go up towards those big candlesticks that are wrapped in red that you can see on the staircase about halfway to the top. There are some red ones on the left and some plain ones on the right. While the Crusader kings of Jerusalem chose to be buried in the Holy Sepulchre Church right below Golgotha, the Armenian queens of Jerusalem preferred tombs near the tomb of Mary. And so the Armenian queen Morphia and her remarkable daughter, Queen Melisande, both have their tombs on this staircase. Morphea's tomb is on the right as one goes up the stairs, inside an Armenian chapel that is dedicated to Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, for whom one of our Midwestern parishes, one of our wonderful parishes, is named. Morphia very much identified with their parental role because, like them, she too had produced a remarkable daughter. Queen Melisande's tomb is opposite to her mother's in a chapel named for Saint Joseph, where the Greeks now have two altars. The ornate marble that was once on the tomb, the iron gates that separated the chapel from the staircase, all of that opulence is no longer there, although if you know where to look, you can see the places where the iron gates still seated in the archway. And no one looking into this chapel who didn't know would immediately recognize it as a royal funerary chapel, let alone as the tomb of Jerusalem's most illustrious Armenian queen. However, when one stands inside Melisant's once luxurious tomb and looks up, there in the darkness, an Armenian dome rises above the space. A dome that now has no purpose since that side of the church has been silted up. And yet there it is, as a silent testimony to the fact that at the peak of its power under the Crusaders, Jerusalem was ruled by women who in language and in culture were Armenian. But this is not an ordinary day, and so we are not going to go up the stairs. Instead, we are going to celebrate the moment when Mary bridged heaven and earth, taking her body with her into the heavenly realm and leaving behind a beautiful affirmation that because of her role, because of her divine Son, the human body is no longer merely dust from the earth to return to dust again, but it is once again worthy to be a robe of heavenly glory. And so we are going to go back down and join the crowd of people who are gathering to worship below. For most of the year, Mary's tomb is a refuge from the noisy, busy world above ground. But at the Feast of the Assumption today, the space is packed full of local Christians, pilgrims, clergy, seminarians. And the darkness in the church gradually turns to light as the growing crowd of faithful fill the stairs with lighted candles. And in bygone centuries, with flowers as well, creating an ascending path of light, a path that's so wide that by the time the service ends, one has to leave the church carefully, not to be set on fire by the light. And so, looking back at the end of this day, one cannot help but remember that for a world that is at times very, very dark indeed, it's good to remind ourselves of the light from the tomb of the divine Christ, matched by the light from the tomb of the very human Mary, and perhaps one day to be matched by the light that will come from all of the tombs of the faithful followers of Christ God. Thank you.